Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar news update video. So in this one we have the trailer for the Braving the Elements official Avatar podcast, the one with Dante Basco and Janet Varney, that's going to be starting next week. So episode 1 is going to be next week, the 22nd. So not too long to wait, and they've put out, I guess, a trailer here. So I guess I'll just play it here and then I'll talk about it. And they also have a bit of an interview with Janet Varney and Dante Basco. I'm not going to go through it in great detail because it's just a lot of typical sort of voice actor chat for the most part, but I'll highlight the important bits, I guess.
Friends, I'm Janet Varney, and I was the voice of Korra on The Legend of Korra.
And I'm Dante Basco, the voice of Zuko on The Last Airbender and General Iroh on The Legend of Korra.
And we're your hosts for Braving the Elements, Nickelodeon's podcast celebrating all things Avatarverse.
We'll recap and discuss every episode of The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. But the podcast is so much more than that.
We have amazing guests from all aspects of the series, from the creators to the cast to the other creative and brilliant minds behind all the things that make this universe so special.
Is it rude that whenever they describe a hybrid animal, I think about if it would be delicious or not?
So whether you're a super fan with encyclopedic knowledge or you're brand new to this incredible world.
Whether you're a bender or a non-bender, everybody's welcome, even if you're not from the Fire Nation.
Wow, Dante, that's incredibly generous of you.
I know. Who even knew that Korra and Zuko would ever have a podcast together?
And that there would be so much laughter and good times. Listen to Avatar Braving the Elements on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes start June 22nd.
So there you have it. Pretty standard stuff in that like a few seconds of it, I guess, are like a trailer of like what actually you're going to hear in the episodes of like Jack DeSena, his comment. The rest of it is just sort of a audio visual description of like what we've got in text before, that here's what the podcast is, without actually showing you any of it. At least for me personally, I probably would have preferred if they just showed like a clip from one of the episodes, longer than like 2 seconds, rather than just like this, which is effectively what we already knew from before. Interestingly, in terms of the visuals, like they had like video of the guests, like you saw Mike, you saw Brian, Jenny Kwan, etc. Is it an audio podcast? Can you choose to get the video version of the podcast, or is it just going to be like audio and then they, in terms of their own like content behind the scenes stuff, have recorded it all? I'm not too sure about that. Now, I personally I'm not subscribed to any video podcasts. I know it's a thing. I don't think it's the most common thing, so we'll see how exactly that works. But you can see it's going to be available on like all the typical places. She even said, wherever you get your podcasts from. So I assume on the 22nd, it's literally just going to be, you open your podcast app, search Avatar Braving the Elements, you'll find it, subscribe, you'll have the episode. And if you absolutely have to, you can go to Spotify or iHeartRadio app to make sure you get it. So it's interesting. I'm excited. I'm definitely going to check out the first episode. I probably will review the first episode, just because I get the impression some people will want to know okay, what is it? Should I check this out? Should I not? My impression right now is that it probably will be more of a thing that is very dependent on the interview subject for each episode, rather than just by default check it out every week. So let's get into the actual article here. So, it's just covering the basic details here. They're going to break down key themes, battles, behind the scenes trivia. They have the premiere here. There's going to be Mike, Brian, Jack DeSena, Jenny Kwan, Andre Zagluzio, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but Hakoda Bumi, voice actor. There's going to be around 40 episodes, which is what they confirmed. They're going to be recapping both ATLA and Korra, which we knew from before. And they're talking about, guests is the big thing here. Debuts next week, Tuesday, June 22nd, on all the usual places, of course. This is just the interview that they have. So how long has the podcast been in the works? She was talking about it a really long time ago. timing was just right. Got to get Dante Basco on board immediately. She knew for a really long time, like last year. She's bad at keeping a secret. And she just gets across here that I don't have any idea what's happening with Avatar Studios. Really, the two of them are kept in the dark because they can't keep secrets. So in terms of this being like a news podcast for Avatar Studios, that is not what you should be expecting. And I think that's an important thing that she said straight away, is that the timing of this is kind of like almost kind of weird, in that this would have been a really cool thing to have like a few years ago. But the timing of it now like fits in terms of the popularity, but it's also weird that we're like desperate for news about like anything new Avatar. And this is just going to be a sort of complete sort of almost nostalgia kind of podcast in a way. The voice actors recapping the show, interviews with the cast and all this sort of stuff. And basically they're saying there won't be news, effectively. How did you prep to recap the show? Janet Varney's been hitting the books, spending a lot of time on the wiki, of course. So that's fine. When do the Mike and Brian episodes roll out? Wouldn't want to go very far without hearing from them. You don't have to wait very long. So the impression I get from that is that like they're not the first episode, but they're like within the first 3 or 4, I guess. So they're one of them is fairly early on. It's hard to tell if they'll be both on the same episode, or if they'll get one-on-one, and who knows. Tease the things that you asked them, inspirations, certain characters. Ask what a fan would ask them. We'll see. We'll see if they ask them what the fans were asking, because all these sort of questions, what were you thinking, why do you draw it like this, what does this mean, it's kind of like at least the certain fans, I guess, would ask those questions, but I'm kind of more like, actually try and ask the big questions. So there's that. We'll see how that goes, because a Mike and Brian interview in 2021 is actually like going to be pretty interesting. They haven't really done one in a while, and they've pretty much like disappeared off the face of the earth in a way since the Avatar Studios announcement. Like, you haven't really heard much from them. I guess it makes sense, but it is interesting that this interview will be the first time you hear from them in a while. Now, it is going to be very interesting to see like when these episodes were recorded. I think they make a comment in one of these questions about like, the timing on this stuff, and I'll get to it when we get to it. Are you assuming people will have seen ATLA before tuning into the podcast? Janet Varney says you'll want to have watched at least book 1 to listen to the podcast. They make too many references, they're basically just saying it probably isn't the best idea to literally have like no experience and just be like, the first episode is like recapping, say, the first 3 episodes. Watch the first 3 episodes and then watch their recap. They're kind of assuming like you have already watched the show for the most part, I think is what they're going for here, but that they're not just going to be like hardcore Avatar podcast. They're going to make references and be as open for everyone, but they're not going to be like super like beginner friendly type thing is the impression I get. Not much to say about that. Having listened to the first episode, you have so many fun recurring segments like Animal Crossing and Most Valuable Bender during the recap. So yeah, I guess they just split it up to have kind of fun things. Like, they talk about the episode. I guess it depends on how much of, when they say recap, are they actually going to like discuss their thoughts on it, and then they just have a few sort of award-like things. That's going to be kind of interesting. Will you address any of the long-standing fan theories that have come up about the world of Avatar? We dive into some of these ideas sometimes, right? I think that'll be an opportunity for us too. We've recorded some episodes without being able to engage in social media yet, and without being able to do as much fan interaction as we want. So, and we've been able, and we're so excited for this part of the reveal to the world happening, because then we can really kick in and start getting some suggestions from the fans. Okay, so the idea here is that they're not like, they haven't recorded them like crazy far in advance, where like we're gonna have like podcasts from like 6 months ago, I guess. It really depends on how they segment this out in terms of like when they do the recap versus when they do the interview. Are they the same thing? Like, is the person who is the interview subject for the episode, are they also discussing the episode recap, or are they separate things? That like there's a lot of stuff like that that we're not really sure of until we actually hear the first episode. I think it's going to be a great one. We're going to take a bunch of questions like that from fans, and we've already said we will fully exploit our relationship with Mike and Brian as much as possible. We are the ambassadors. We're happy to try and get answers to that heretofore have not been answered. So, to me, that probably says that they've only probably done maybe like 5, 6, 7 episodes that to have in the bag. And once they hit those, then they can actually react to what people are saying after the early episodes and change it for the later episodes. And then the fact that they're talking about sort of like they'll interact with fans to determine what questions they'll basically ask people like Mike and Brian, I guess means we are going to get a few more sort of like modern, like up to date interviews. Because I think my fear here was just that we'd have a Mike and Brian interview from like 9 months ago, and it like the existence of Avatar Studios just isn't a thing. Whereas I want to hear what Mike and Brian are talking about, how they view Avatar now that they know they're making so much more of it. Because they basically didn't say anything outside of the initial Avatar Studios announcement. So there's a few interesting things about how those type of interviews are going to go. Favorite episode you've recorded so far? Jenny Kwan episode. The cast reunion they did in January. Mako. Greg Baldwin. Andrea Romano. Yeah, there's not too much to say about these last couple of questions. But I suppose just coming back here. How do I feel going into this? I'm excited. Am I viewing this as being anywhere near as like exciting as, say, a new comic release or merchandise release? Not quite, because ultimately what this is going to be is just sort of a more regular way for us to get interviews. I guess it will be a way for us to get interviews with people we don't typically get interviews from, and because they sort of know their audience, maybe more focused interviews, I guess, because you can tell from some of the, say, like Dark Horse streams that they really went a little like off the rails and just had like a conversation with each other, and there wasn't really much sense of like really asking any sort of notable questions, and maybe it being in more of a direct like structure of like part of it is going to be like basically recapping or reviewing the episodes. That will allow, you know, an interesting dynamic of like the voice actors or whatever getting to properly like discuss and give their thoughts on specific episodes, especially if, like, I assume like they're going to say get Jenny Kwan on to do the, you know, Warriors of Kyoshi episode or something like that, and they have them kind of lined up in that way where like they have very thematic guests for each episode. That could work. It is the official podcast, and they're making a big deal about it here in terms of like the press release announcing it, and now a trailer on EW. That's kind of big. So, you know, I kind of dismissed it as like no news whatsoever, but I'm kind of wondering at this point, like, might they do something? I doubt it. Like, if there's going to be any major news, like, they'll make it its own separate thing. But I don't know, a few just hints, you know. Again, it's going to be the Mike and Brian episodes that I suppose are the main ones, but you know, it's going to be interesting. Like once we get past the first few, and then we maybe get into the idea and they start to have like interviews with some of the maybe voice actors for some of the more minor characters. Is it still going to hold up? You know, 20-30 podcasts in, we'll have to wait and see. In terms of like, you know, do we expect this to be the most in-depth podcast from the two of them? Perhaps not, but they're clearly trying because they know they need to come across as knowledgeable on this podcast. Otherwise, you know, they'll get a little bit of criticism from the fans. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see as well. Oftentimes in like interviews, you know, the voice actors are kind of very much kind of hidden behind only ever being asked a set number of questions of like, Janet Varney, what are your thoughts on Cora's character arc during this moment? What was it like voicing Cora? What was it like in the booth with all these other voice actors? The same like questions over and over again. The ones that she answered at Comic-Con that year, in this interview over here, they talked about in the Dark Horse streams, you know, the same sort of questions. This is going to be a little bit different in terms of, you know, where we're getting into like more technical kind of stuff and they're actually having to review and talk about more detailed stuff. I'm actually kind of excited to see that, because to me, like, a large part of why I don't particularly get much out of voice actor interviews is because it is the same questions over and over again. So, you know, I want to hear what they have to say about Avatar. Like Janet Varney talking about ATLA, a show she wasn't like involved in herself. She didn't voice act on it. And so when she talks, I'm guessing she's going to have to talk about the show rather than just voice acting. Because that's, like I said, that's always the kind of fear with the voice actors, is just that everything's always going to come back to, well, in the booth this day, which are fun sometimes, but you don't want to hear that like every single time. So I guess that's going to be the thing during ATLA, of like, how much do they go to Dante's experience working on the show with Cora? How much do they go to Janet, time working on the show, versus just actually doing the recap? That's the balance that I think they need to get right. So I will probably like review the first episode. I think that's something I'll do. I definitely wouldn't really commit to, you know, I'm going to review every episode of the podcast. I think it's worth it for the first one just to see what it's like. And then obviously if they get Mike and Brian on, or maybe some of the more interesting writers, or even say like maybe they have a Zach Tyler Eisen on or something like that, those ones, you know, it might be worth, you know, doing as news. Just like if anything comes out of the podcast, you know, it's definitely going to be an interesting place to see what comes out of it. But you know, I'm expecting massive news or anything like that. Not really. We'll have to wait and see. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I want to talk about. Just, I suppose, final thing, bit of news. I did get my review copy for Suki Alone. So on the channel tomorrow, you will see a non-spoiler review for Suki Alone. Early non-spoiler review. So if you're excited to hear some insight into Suki Alone, how I liked it or whatever, check out the video tomorrow. But other than that, what are your thoughts on Braving the Elements, the trailer that we got here, the interview we got here, and just your final expectations before we actually head into the episode next week? How are you feeling about Braving the Elements? But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.